and welcome to Found in Translation, a weekly-ish exploration of one fellow's translation of the Christian scriptures, one chapter or so at a time. I'm Brandon Rhodes, and across the internet from me is the translator himself, Brandon Johnson. Hi, Brandon.
Hey, Brandon.
I'm looking forward to this season. Good to see you. Time for season 6 here.
Yeah, we're making our way through stuff here.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So, listeners, we are going to be going through one of the more arcane and esoteric pieces of the Apostle Paul's corpus. This letter, short little letter.
So, how many $10 words can you get in there?
That he wrote called to the church in Rome. We call it Romans usually. I don't know if you've heard it or read it, but yeah. Hopefully this is not your first introduction. How does it feel? Like this is like considered one of the greatest pieces of most important pieces of literature in European descended civilizations, and you're like, I'll try translating that.
It was pretty daunting. I put it off for quite a while. I figured I needed at least half of the Christian Testament under my belt before I did it. So that's enough worry.
That's right, because you've already, we've only covered 5 other letters, but you've done another 5 or more beyond that before you even got to Romans.
Yeah.
I was like, let's get to 10.
I think I'm working on number 19. Romans was the 18th.
Okay.
Finished.
Okay, so this is going to be still very fresh for you, so hopefully it's not going to bring up any adverse experiences that are lingering in your body from this, because, cross your heart and hope to make good radio, at least.
Yeah.
So if this is your first time listening to us, the way we do this is we've got in the episode notes, if you're listening to us, if you're watching us on the YouTube or Facebook, in the video description, we'll have links to the Google Doc for this, where you can read it that way. There's also a PDF link as well, and we do have a mobile-friendly PDF that has a whole bunch of end notes, but at least it's scaled so that you can read it on your pocket computer of choice. So that's how we're going to do this. Brandon, can you recap for people who are new to this? We do this, I think, at the start of every season. What are the values guiding this translation project? What are the biases that you are actively bringing to this work?
Yeah. I mean, we're trying to do a number of things. One is be faithful to how I understand what it's trying to say, which I really do try to wait until I'm translating before I try to decide what I think it already means, right? I'm not trying to come in I want to make it say this. But there is an active bending that I do. So both in individual word definitions and how they fit together in the grammar, there's usually more than one way to handle it, to bring it into the English. And what has often been done is that people have consistently sided with the options within that range that lean toward authoritarianism or toward humans are just inherently turds. And I'm trying to do the opposite, or hyper spiritualizing, making everything about afterlife and not about this life. And so what I'm trying to do is, what I'm seeing in it is, if trying to stay within the range of what is an actual option of how to translate, leaning towards things that emphasize liberation and healing and combating shame and emphasizing how things impact us in this life. and that kind of stuff because I that's how I understand what it means, and so I'm trying to like highlight those things in the choices that I'm making.
Right. Right. And the way you summarized some of those, the received biases in existing translations,
Mhm.
really is those are all kind of parts of a total way of telling the sacred story, um, that we're going to return to time and time again. And I don't know if there is a place that you're going to see more proof texts and like the people who like that dominant story the most annoyingly tend to also really like they think Romans is on their side, and I hope this season is a
Mhm.
demonstration that um they're telling the story fundamentally wrong. Like you said, you talked about over spiritualizing,
Mhm.
authoritarianism, shame.
Mhm.
Was there one more in there? Um,
Yeah, the turdiness of humanity.
the turdiness of humanity.
Yeah,
Yeah. So to
essentially,
put that into
you're
story,
just inherently bad and worthless.
yeah, yeah. So they're the people who like total depravity is kind of their like theological fetish and one of their starting points. Their two starting points are God is an authoritarian,
Mhm.
the nature of God being all powerful is unmitigated and triumphs over this parallel claim that God is love.
Mhm.
So the second foundational claim is that we, in contrast to that authoritarian, are absolute shit. We are worthy of punishment and damnation. We are unlovable, and yet God does love us, which, as an aside, kind of therefore means we are lovable. Anyway, there's so many contradictions to it.
All
So their
things are
story,
possible with God, Brandon.
yeah, apparently, including, yeah,
Loving the unlovable.
logical
Yeah.
contradictions. Yeah. So their story is an authoritarian God renders us pieces of shit, and we are worthy of punishment. Therefore, God takes on the punishment through being Jesus uh, crucified,
Mhm.
and uh, the way to gain purchase on that pardon or forgiveness or way through towards non-shittiness is some squishy sense of belief,
Mhm.
um, that's apart from our behavior, and yet behavior still matters. It's very confusing at this point.
Yeah.
And therefore, the culmination of it is, therefore, you go to heaven when you die. Fundamentally, this has nothing to say about the beauty of this life, the agonies of this life, the mysteries of this life, has nothing to say about endangered species or the taste of a good wine or the magic of making love or the like wonder of a good dog. Like there's all the or like the injustice of the harm we do to the poor, to queer folk, to undocumented folk. Um, all these things don't really matter because we get to go to heaven afterwards.
Mhm.
So very ultra spiritual. So you at every single point here have been finding these little footholds in the translation and saying, "Oh, hang on."
Yeah. Yeah, a key metric for me is like in deciding which of the legitimate options to go with was does this cause harm or
Mm,
does this cause healing? Like and so much of what most of us are used to is actively harmful.
Yeah. Yeah.
If anyone's curious about the fastest way to find the talking points for the harmful version of this, it's the Romans Road, which I was taught to memorize growing up as like the talking points for what how to be saved. So
Mm.
it's Romans 3:23, 6:23, 5:8, 6:1 through 5, and 10:9 and 10. Just
Hang on, the Romans
I'm not
road
in
is out of order?
I oh, I just listed it
Oh,
in
okay.
order.
Well,
Yeah.
I'm just thinking like their
3:23,
proof
5,
texts are
8,
like
6, 1 through
zigzagging
5,
pretty hard there.
6:23.
So
Yeah,
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 can
no, I
you
don't
so
yeah.
the Romans road, can you summarize like what the cultural legacy of that is and then what it is?
Yeah, it's a tool that assumes that the best way to be a faithful Christian is to talk to well anyone, strangers, acquaintances, coworkers, friends, family members, and make sure they know how bad they are so that they will then be grateful for an escape route to get to go to heaven anyway. Um, yeah, and so that uses these so sets of verses to, to summarize that concept.
Hmm. And even if you never heard it as called the Romans road, if you spent much time in late 20th century or to present evangelicalism, the basic shape of this logic of this is actually the truth. This is the core story.
Yeah,
It's imprinted on you. It's in your hymns, it's in your Bible studies, it's in your prayers.
yeah. I actually wrote out a little paragraph that summarizes
Okay,
walking through them. You know, we are all sinful and enemies of God, despite not deserving it because of how sinful we are. Christ died for us because of how much God loves us. What we deserve as our rightful punishment for being sinful is death. But God wants to give us life through Jesus instead. Just because. Uh, we were given the opportunity to die with Christ and be raised to new life with Him, both symbolized through baptism. So, if you publicly announce that you think Jesus is God and you think He came back to life, you will go to heaven after you die instead of hell, which is what you deserve. Also, the announcing and thinking don't earn it, just in case you think you have anything to your own credit. And
mm,
end of supposedly the gospel.
yeah, ugh. Yeah. So that's kind of one of the largest and loudest legacies of it in recent history. It's worth acknowledging also the legacy of Romans as being one of the largest shifts in the history of the church. You know, there was Mark 1 was becoming institutionalized in around 300 to 400 AD. Then around 800 to 1000, you've got the schism breaking apart east of west. And then around 1500, you've got Martin Luther reading Romans and some Galatians. And having this realization, it was pivotal in his own awakening of how wrongly um, the imperial church of his time had gotten what the heart of this thing is all about. And so Protestants are particularly into Romans. Um, it's like our pendulum at some level has been kind of permanently stuck, not just in Romans, but in a particular reading of it.
Mm,
So you can't wander through the halls of Protestantism of any flavor, save maybe parts of Anabaptism, but really, no. without like doing the work of of living with Romans.
Hmm.
It's also a place where there's a number of other proof texts that are used for some pretty problematic uh, things out there. Um, well, next week we're going to talk with Micah from the wonderful podcast, The Word in Black and Red. They're doing a leftist approach to the entire Hebrew canon, which is amazing. As we publish this, it'll probably be between them finishing the Genesis and getting into Exodus. So it's a good time to jump
Hmm.
on their journey. They're going to be with us next week to talk about um, Romans 1:26 and 27, which is one of the biggest clobber passage used to dehumanize, exclude, and harm LGBT kin.
Which, spoiler alert, that's not even what it's about.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Next episode is going to be great and very frustrating for people who thought that Jesus says it's okay to be mean to queer folk. Um, what are some other gross legacies that this book?
One that I don't fully understand, but just happen to know about is that the KKK are really excited about Romans 12, apparently. I'm not really
That's
even sure what in it they like so much, but apparently at their headquarters, they have a Bible open to Romans 12 with a sword blade over it. It's like symbolic of something.
yuck. Uh, well, and then right after that is Romans 13, which begins with this sense of yeah, somewhere in there is be in submission to the governments about over you, those governing above you that God has placed there. It goes the conventional translations and the conventional and the tradition around it is that God chose and appointed everybody who's in systems of uh, worldly power, and therefore you need
Yeah,
to
yeah,
submit and obey them, except for the American colonists rebelling against the British crown.
right. That's the one exception. Apparently.
Yeah, yeah. There's these weird exceptions, or yeah, all of the January 6th knuckleheads. Um, yeah,
Mm.
very selective, but it's so yeah, and we're gonna get into it in like 3 months worth of podcasting through this. But suffice to say, that creates a world of problems and justifications for domination. And we one of our controlling theological hunches is that Jesus has no time for domination or authoritarianism.
Right.
Christianity is fundamentally an anti-authoritarian way of being human together.
Yeah.
Yeah,
But
so we're
that's somehow the opposite of what most of us are handed.
yeah. A theme we've had to address elsewhere has been um, translation decisions that really tempt readers towards anti-Semitism.
Mm. There's certainly examples in Romans of that.
Yeah, yeah, because there's such an emphasis on faith versus works and Torah versus spirit, but they usually say law versus spirit. It kind of comes across as making the Jewish people into the bad guys and the practitioners of um, works righteousness or whatever the hell. Um, so yeah, there are plenty of places where we're gonna stub our toe on anti-Semitic leaning translation choices that have been made over the past 2 millennia.
Mhm. My hope is that how I'm doing it and how we're talking about it is correcting that. I hope.
Yeah, let us hope. Lord, hear our prayer.
Mhm.
Yeah, we're gonna stub our toe onto all kinds of other things that are broadly just gonna be about that big story of like the big story is about the authoritarian God punishing us for breaking his, in their world it's a he, his rules. We should go to hell. Jesus died so that we don't, and then we go to heaven. That story we're going to bump into relentlessly in conventional in not just the translations but the way the lens that
Mhm.
we've been trained to read this letter through.
Yeah. Just weird because it never talks about heaven or hell in Romans. Somehow we just assume that's what it is hinting at.
Yeah, yeah, dangling over us. Well, should we give a quick summary of like what the context is of Romans?
Yeah. Yeah.
What do you
I
think
mean,
people should know?
essentially, it's kind of coming back to the anti-Semitic part. It's actually the opposite. It's trying to get Jewish Christians and non-Jewish Christians to recognize that they're both included, that it's not a competition between them, and understanding Paul is uniquely qualified to understand why each of them might think so, that they're the ones who are in and the others are out, and is really arguing over and over again, like, that's not, no, you're missing it.
Yeah, yeah, it's a pastoral letter.
Hmm.
uh the context of this being written probably in the early 60s current era. um Paul to a church that Paul had not founded or visited yet. He
Hmm.
prided himself on being the guy who goes out to all the Greek and Roman cities and um, activating parts of synagogues and Gentile listeners into these old Jesus hubs. And someone got to Rome first, so he's got a little bit of like envy and covetousness to like establish what he thinks this thing is about.
Hmm. Yeah, let me help steer you in the right direction since you didn't get me my input from the beginning.
Yeah, yeah. Like I don't know if you have all the same tools that I hope the other guys do, which a lot of the other letters are he's like, you guys are really effing up. So stop sleeping with
Yeah,
your stepmoms. Um,
yeah, yeah, yeah. I haven't gotten to that one yet. That's another book that I've been putting off.
yeah, also awkward.
Yeah.
Frowned upon anyway. Uh, so it's pastoral and also kind of a mark of like I don't think it's like meant to be his magnum opus or the summary of his theology. It's him trying to
Oh,
bring to bear as if for the first time some of the big points of his vision of this faith to
yeah.
a
So it
particular.
does kind of touch on some of the basics in a way that maybe the others kind of skim over
Yeah,
because he's not assuming they already know.
yeah. So if you take it through the lens of this is a racial reconciliation question, um the famous British New Testament scholar N.T. Wright, well, he historically places the writing of this letter after the Romans had kicked all the Jewish people out of Rome. I think they were blamed for something naughty, and then they got to come back in.
Yeah.
So
There
instead
was
of
a
it,
fire that they got blamed for.
that's it. Thank you.
Yeah.
And we didn't start the fire. Uh, they came back in. Usually, it's him having to like start with a hub of Jewish followers of Jesus and then graft in Gentiles into that because that's the historic, like we Gentiles are grafted into the story of Israel. And in this case, it's an overwhelmingly Gentile church, non-Jewish church, and their Jewish neighbors are moving back in. Some of them are like, Jesus might be the Messiah, and so he's kind of having to like remotely try to address a similar thing, but kind of through the other end of the scope.
Hmm. Yeah, and he addresses both sides, I think, in Romans.
Yeah, yeah, and he seems really committed to like helping, making sure for as often as it seems like he's like trying to break the fixations of the Jewish listeners around like some things about Torah, he's also like in some ways his most strident with the Gentile listeners about like, no, you are grafted into the story of Israel through Jesus.
Right, right,
You are, this is, you can't de-Judaize Christianity. And the way I'm going
right.
to argue for you guys even being part of this is only going to be through the story of Israel.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, I think, just to rewind a minute there, talking about this being like he's hitting some of his core beats,
Hmm.
but applied to a particular pastoral question. I think if the question were of like LGBTQ inclusion or the full dignity and worth of women, or like take any other like cis place where a difference became a division in a place of domination,
Hmm.
and he would have figured out how to tell the story of Israel culminating in the story of Jesus in a way that it invites them both to be folded into a new kind of belonging together.
Right. Yeah, consistently over and over, Paul, but the whole Bible is uh, God wants to include more people.
Yes.
And as liberal or progressive as the reader might be, take it further. God is even more inclusive than that.
Hmm. Yeah. 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 So that could be an interesting almost midrash exercise of like rewrite Romans if Paul were trying to figure out how to like hit some core beats for him about how people are folded into a new belonging together through Jesus.
That
Um,
would be an interesting exercise.
yeah, but do
Yeah.
it through the question of sexual and gender diversity,
Hmm.
American like settler and indigenous,
Yep.
whatever differences there are. How is he going to break apart domination and division into a new
Hmm.
Jesus rooted belonging?
Yep.
I think you can hit all the beats of the story and it would look really similar to Romans, but he wouldn't be talking about Abraham as much or just differently.
Yeah. Although Abraham isn't particularly important because that is well where the inclusion of everybody is grounded is the
Yes.
promise to Abraham. So,
Yep.
which we'll come back to. But
Yes, we will. I'm looking forward to that. Um, why don't we so we're going to spend this episode really focusing on a thesis, couple of verses, which is Romans 1, 16 and 17.
mhm,
Um, I think before we do that, it'll be good to do two things. One, just acknowledge, like, go through the big arc of this letter. What is the big flow of it as we
yeah,
read it? And then two, just to say, there's a whole bunch of translation decisions. Holy shit, look at the count of footnotes before we get to the thesis verse of in your eyes of 116. There are
yeah,
so many important words that we're just not going to acknowledge in this episode that you did hard work on. They're going to be in the footnotes in the Google Doc
mhm,
and the PDF. But we'll have time. We're going to have time to touch on a lot of the important ones in the remaining 15 episodes we're going to have going through this thing.
Yeah.
But if you do have questions, drop us a line or
Yeah.
comment.
Yeah, I'd love to have some more dialogue about this.
Yeah. So how would you walk us through the big flow, the big arc of this long ass letter?
Yeah. I mean, so the 16 and 17, like you mentioned, is like the thesis statement. It's kind of the controlling thought for the whole book. Um, and so it's talking about the messages about restoring restoration for everyone, Jews and Greeks, or Greeks being kind of a representative of everyone else. Um, and faithfulness leads to more faithfulness. So, and then you have kind of the what I started calling the counter thesis, and the other Brandon was confused because I just made it up. But the conclusion statement, kind of the restating it in different words, happens in chapter 15, 7 through 13, where Paul kind of restates the same thing and gives like 3 or 4 different Hebrew Bible references that clearly identify that the whole point all along was for the work of Israel to be including everyone else. Um, and then there's kind of a pivot point in the middle in chapter 8, and that serves as that pivot point. And so it's working through, okay, everyone's involved here. You got to start treating people as having value, no domination, no humiliating each other, no treating people as less than objects. Here's the core argument about why Jews are not more valuable than everyone else, but certainly in get to the argument about Abraham and the kind of that foundational concept that leads to that sense of everyone's included. Then also, by the way, you non-Jews, you're in but grafted in. You're an addition into the story of Israel, not a replacement. Um, then getting into some of the core, like, what are we? What does being included and being in mean? Stepping away from causing harm, causing oppression, causing hardship, um, and leaning into breathing life, being part of life givingness for the community, for everybody. Uh, and then starts getting into some more practical, like, so how is this showing up?
Hmm.
What are the ways that we're doing this? And
Yeah.
then coming back to summarize again.
Hmm. Yeah. That sounds pretty different from how the flow of the book is usually stated.
Yeah.
And it really does feel like the dominant interpretation and translation is this is the question, a vertical question. How do you go to heaven when you die? Um, and what we're saying is the story seems to be heaven can't come to earth before we die unless we solve some of these horizontal questions of like figuring out how to belong together.
Yeah. Or maybe rather, heaven coming to earth before we die is us solving those
Yeah,
questions.
that's what I mean. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
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 So yeah, it a controlling like I don't like the word controlling. It feels too controlling. Um, a
The
tool that
guiding principle,
yeah,
a
the
guiding principle, maybe.
a
Yeah.
guiding
Yeah.
principle for us. Well, I think a curiosity, like a thing that I'm like I try to be alert for is anytime I'm reading something that's like my trained vertical story lens
Hmm.
is like gripping me. Ask, is there actually something fundamentally horizontal? Is there something about, I mean, I would say, is there something fundamentally incarnational going on here? God wants to be all in all, and the way for God to be all in all is for all to be all together, right? For everything to
Mm-hmm.
belong, as Father Richard Rohr says. And I find just about every god dang time I see a vertical text and hold it in heart and in curiosity and intellectual rigor, it does turn out to be this very incarnational instinct of the vertical becoming
It's
horizontal.
it's true.
Yeah. Yeah. And what's the worst that happens if we turn out to be wrong on that? People were cared for, held in love, have new friends, a wider sense of family. Oops.
We've loved our neighbors.
Yeah.
Yeah,
God may not be so. Um yeah. So let's get into this. Let's get into Romans 1.
yeah. Pull it up on the screen here.
Okay, we've got a slice of your translation of the early part of Romans up on the screen. Um, verses 16 and 17 is what you've found in your own study to feel like the closest Paul is going to give us to a thesis statement.
Hmm. Yeah. So I can go ahead and read those two verses and we can get into it.
Great.
You see, I am not shamed by the triumphant message, since it is the power of God for restoration for everyone who is faithful, for Jews first, and then also for Greeks. God's justness is revealed by it because of faithfulness that results in faithfulness, just as it is written, the just will be alive because of faithfulness.
The word of the
The
Lord.
word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. So
So we've
yeah,
got a whole
there's
bunch of. Go ahead.
a lot of words that are different than what most of us are used to in there.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to walk through those kind of one by one, but first, like at a big level, what makes this feel like the thesis, and what the hell is the implication of that?
Yeah, I mean, he both in his very first introductory verses and in the verse right before this. So I'm ready to announce the triumphant message among you who are in Rome as well. Uh, kind of the point is, I want you to understand what the triumphant message is. Uh, triumphant message being how I'm translating what's traditionally good news or gospel.
Hmm.
Um, and we can talk more at some point about why I'm translating it that way. But um, and so this is why this is important. This is who it's for. This is it. This is what I need you to understand about this, and I'm going to tease that out in more detail to the rest of the book.
Right. Now,
So
what strikes
in yeah, go ahead.
well, so what strikes me about this is like it's for as much as we talked about racial reconciliation, a new kind of belonging, a new kind of humanity, grounded in neighborly care and solidarity for one another. None of those words or synonyms are happening here in the thesis statement. He's saying like the
Yeah.
gospel, the triumphant message is okay, so it's restoration for everyone. And then there's like all this talk about justness and faithfulness and
Hmm.
yeah, like connect me a dot or two, would you?
Yeah. Um, so justness and faithfulness are essentially the way of the Lord explained through Torah, through the Hebrew Bible, through Jesus. Uh, It's like tracing out a way of being
Hmm.
that, and so just being essentially like in alignment with God's way of being. Um, is what it's talking about, where it's revealed by living it out faithfully, being committed to it, being holding a sense of trust that this is the way to be. This is actually going to do what it's promising and lead to good things,
Yeah.
even if it's hard, even if it's counterintuitive, even if it takes a long time and isn't an immediate fix. And so, but doing faithfulness, uh, assuming that doesn't explicitly say this, but assuming that we're talking about Christ's faithfulness that results in the faithfulness of the disciples in the church, that results in the people experiencing that faithfulness. And so they want in and they also become faithful and live out these values. That creates more life, which is what's taught, the just will be alive because of faithfulness.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the basic what it's talking about there. Uh, People being restored, liberated, even
Hmm.
uh, from oppression, from suffering, and finding more life, more flourishing, thriving
Yeah.
together.
Yeah. It's really asking, okay, that's great and swell, the idea of like belonging together. On what freaking grounds? Like I think there's a
Hmm.
layer of liberalism that we've inherited in the West that particularly our generation has a clear sense of like on the left to, on the socially left side of things. Um like, hey, this is a democracy, man. Like get your government out of our business. Like everybody has a right to like life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We're all equal before the government. Like there is a sense, um, an inherited and, pardon the word, secular sense of like a larger belonging in like a some civic sense.
Hmm.
And there are ways that that tradition morally has argued to justify that. It's not really quite what's happening here. It's asking the question of like, on what
Hmm.
grounds should people who have been marked as outside be grafted into this stream of um partnering with creator?
Right.
Like freaking
Yeah.
show your
And there's a
work.
lot of,
And so,
yeah. He's trying to prove it. That's what Romans essentially is proving that inclusion is the thing. Um,
yeah.
and he's doing that because people are pushing back. That's why he says, I'm not ashamed about the triumphant message. Like he is being very inclusive, and people are being like, no, Paul, you're being too inclusive. You should be ashamed of yourself. You got it wrong.
And notice how close this is. This is going to be a funny part of going through Romans is how close a lot of the sort of casual theological centers for Protestants in particular, evangelicals in particular, have of like, there's nothing you can do to earn your salvation. It is a pure gift from God, which is like, well, yeah, sure, sure. There's nothing you can do to earn your liberation if we change that word. Um,
Hmm.
it is a pure gift from God. It is like you get like the payload of like some of the good parts of ways of reading Romans this side of Luther. There are some good layers to a fundamentally screwed up way of reading it that are worth
Hmm.
holding on to. Yeah, really leaning into the sense of like that tradition using the language of grace. You use generosity often instead of grace.
Hmm.
That's fantastic. You get that along the way. when you are also hearing it in the key of this question of social belonging and being grafted into to a story that you that is not yours.
Yeah. And it's more than just tolerance, which is, I
Yeah.
suppose, a good starting point, but it's not just belonging, inclusion in the sense of I'm not being actively excluded, but like we're a family. We care for each other. We take care of each other. We bring each other in. We make sure our needs are met. We make sure you feel the belonging. You make
Yes.
sure that you receive your basic needs. It's full inclusion, not just offhand. Okay, well, we're not going to force you to leave, but
Yeah.
sit quiet in the back.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Begrudging minority rights. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. There's a fundamental question of like the giftfulness, the gift of the difference that is um there are these promises that like the long arc of it in the prophets, that the long arc of Israel's story is that the riches of the Gentiles shall stream to Zion. And we picture carts full of gold and maybe incense and myrrh
mhm,
and frankincense, right? Um, what if the Gentiles are the riches? There's a way in which this new belonging, this folding in of the fullness of God's
yeah.
desire to incarnate.
That's that's fun. I That makes me think of Matthew 6, where I translated treasure in heaven, what's traditionally treasure in heaven, as what God values.
Ooh,
Uh, that really fits with what you're saying there, because
yeah,
God values people.
yeah, yeah. So you're getting like the question of like the dignity and worth of a human for Paul is grounded in the faithfulness of God, the love
Hmm.
of God, the justness of God. That doesn't mean, but apart from that, we are pieces of shit. There's no
Yeah.
sense of that. That is inserting our own neuroses
Yeah.
and fear into the text.
Yep. And it makes me think of Galatians 3, where Paul defines the triumphant message, the gospel, as the promise to Abraham and quotes it there. It doesn't quite get as clear in Romans 4 as it does there in Galatians 3, but it's basically the same discussion in Romans 4.
And the promise to
Um,
Abraham is,
it's the way I've translated it as that through your descendants, all people groups will be praised as worthy.
hmm, yeah,
And it's like they're worthy of what? Full inclusion, because they have the same value as Abraham's biological descendants.
yeah, absolutely. So there's a couple other words here in this in your translation of this thesis statement that
Hmm.
we should acknowledge here in the last 10 minutes or so of the episode. So we're going to touch on each of
Yeah.
these repeatedly in the following episodes. But so
Yeah,
we've
we'll
got
spend
triumphant
more
message,
time in
gospel.
depth, but
Yeah.
yep. Restoration is what's traditionally their salvation.
Mm.
Um, I often do it as liberation, which wouldn't be terrible here, but restoration feels more appropriate in the context. The sense of salvation is really a synonym with liberation. But it has come theologically technical word for meaning you get to go to heaven when you die.
Yes.
Um, or even better, but still missing it, like you've been made right with God, like you're in God's good graces again. You're like God's happy with you now. Uh, you've said I'm sorry in the right way, so God is okay with you now. You're good,
Hmm.
which is still just not really the point. It's not a terrible idea, um, but it is much more about the shape of the experience of the community here and now, not about a one-on-one relationship with God or something that happens after you die.
Right. So next up, you've got faithful. For everyone who
Yeah,
is faithful, usually who believes.
who believes is the more typical. Yeah. Um, and which is related then to faithfulness down there. It's typically that's faith. Both uh, same basic Greek word pistis or pistos,
Hmm.
depending on adjective or noun. So it's yeah, I never use faith as my translation. It there is a kind of a range of meaning, but they're all kind of interconnected. So it's either on the one side, kind of trusting in in a way that leads to acting on that trust. So the emphasis being more on the trust, but it's a faithful kind of trust, or on the other side of emphasizing the faithfulness, the acting that is grounded in trusting, um, typically in trusting God or trusting Jesus, trusting that the way of being human, God and Jesus and Bible are trying to inspire, trying to guide us
Yeah.
in is is worthwhile. Yes.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm. Yeah. And that translation shift, it's going to be a big one that we're going to talk over in the future. But just to tip our hand on like why is faith a word not worthy of using? Short way of putting it is the way forward is not belief, it's not cognitive assent, it's not having the
right,
right opinions when you close and squeeze your eyes in contrast to behavior. That is not what the question is.
right.
It's much more animated. It's a fully integrated sense of like behavior and trusting commitment,
Hmm.
allegiance. All these words are meant to like hold
Yeah,
together
fidelity.
interior and exterior together.
Hmm.
And then it's contrasted with, in that it's not in this verse, but like the whole works language. That's actually a way of saying the boundary markers for social belonging that we are accustomed to, whether it's circumcision
Right.
or Sabbath or being cisgender or
Hmm.
white coding your behavior.
Hmm.
Uh, that is what works righteousness is proving your belonging by conformity.
Right.
And Jesus,
Right.
God, Paul is arguing from historically this end of Jesus and this end of Abraham that that's a load of shit. The faithfulness that we
Hmm.
see in both of these characters is what expresses um, our belonging beyond conformity,
Right.
and it's faithfulness,
Yeah.
not right opinion.
Yeah. And too often it's not just right opinion, but it's right opinion that you should just accept and parrot without any evidence.
Holy shit! Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. The gospel of justification is that you believe like we do, and Jesus died so that
Mhm.
you could believe
And don't
what
ask
we believe. Yeah.
questions.
God, what miserable crap that is. Um,
Yeah.
okay, we got a couple more to talk on.
Yeah, I think the other one I touched on was where I have justness. It's traditionally righteousness,
Hmm.
which even in English are related. Uh, it's the example I keep coming back to is the English words, and this is the same in the Greek. Right, like a right angle, it's a straight angle, and just like justified margins in a document where it's a straight line
Oh
up
yeah.
and down. Um, there's the sense of alignment, is what it's talking about. Being aligned with the, there's lots of imagery. Um, path, the way
Mm-hmm.
is another way to say the path of Christ, the way of the Lord, the way to live that's aligned with who God is, what God is hoping for as the community that's putting us down a trajectory. Even the word Torah is the noun version of the verb for shoot an arrow. It's like there's a straight line tracing the path forward toward shalom, toward true justice, where everyone has what they need, toward jubilee, toward new creation, whatever imagery. There's so many
Uh-huh.
different
Yeah.
images throughout scriptures that are trying to like fill in this picture of what are we talking about. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but yeah, so justness is alignment with how we get to that place where
Mm-hmm.
it's good for everybody and we're all connected and in a reciprocal relationship with each other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's God's vindication, it's God's trustworthiness. Like these are
Hmm.
all, you kind of gotta have a thesaurus packed into each of some of these
Yeah,
words.
yeah.
Like God will be vindicated. God is trustworthy because of the faithfulness that results in faithfulness. Just
Hmm.
as right, like
Yeah.
it
And so
we're
at,
gonna
at
like
some
repeat
point,
ourselves a bit to make sure it flows.
right, yeah. And I think some of these words that are like not great now, like probably even faith, it's in English, even centuries ago, it probably was a better word to use. Righteousness was not the wrong word to use because it's talking about alignment with these things, but we have started to take it to mean good instead of bad,
Yeah.
worthwhile instead of worthless, uh, right instead of wrong, which even right is not a bad word if you're understanding it to be aligned with who God is, with the way that leads to life for everyone and flourishing
Hmm.
for everyone. Um, even like in Buddhism, they have the Eightfold Path, where it's, I don't remember all of the ones like right meditation, right thinking, right this, and it's not like correct instead of incorrect. It's aligned with the way that brings goodness.
Yeah.
Um,
Attuned. Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So language has changed over centuries, and we've the words that became like a theological technical terms, theological jargon, have gotten stuck as that word, even though how we understand that word has changed. And so our understanding of that word is no longer faithful to what the scripture is saying.
Bingo. Yeah. This is gonna be a fun season. Uh, we've got to wrap up this week. We are both so thankful for your company for this leg of the journey. The easiest way to support Found in Translation is to leave us a rating or a review on whatever app or player or website you are enjoying this on, particularly if that is Apple Podcasts or YouTube. That makes it easier for more people to find the show. You can find us on Facebook as Found in Translation. The Google Doc and PDFs of Brandon's translation of Romans is in the episode notes of this episode. You can follow Brandon Johnson on Threads as at Old Song New Dance and read more of his work at oldsongnewdance.com. You can follow me on Threads as at BD Rhodes, BDRHODES. The music you're listening to is by Kevin MacLeod at Incompetech.com. Bound in Translation was produced by Perry FM on unceded Chinook and Kalapuya land. Goodbye, Brandon.
Random.
Bye, everybody.